Maeve Hollis sat frozen in her wheelchair on an abandoned railway crossing the front wheel, wedged deep between rotting wooden planks as fog swallowed the tracks in every direction. Somewhere beyond the mist, a freight train horn sounded low at first, then closer, each blast stealing another second from her life. At 76, Maeve had survived storm's loss and decades of solitude, but nothing had prepared her for the helplessness of being trapped inches from death, knowing no one was supposed to be there to see her. Just beyond the trees, Ronan Ketter, a former Navy SEAL, was on a solitary morning run trying to outrun memories that refused to fade. He had no idea that fate was already pulling him off his path. Then a young German shepherd puppy burst from the fog, frantic and wild-eyed. The dog didn't bark for attention. He grabbed Ronan's pant leg and pulled with desperate strength, then ran back toward the tracks and barked again. That puppy was not playing. He was pleading. In that moment, a soldier who thought his days of rescue were over was being summoned into one final test of courage, faith, and timing, where seconds would decide whether a life was lost or saved. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more stories of hope, faith, and quiet miracles. Morning arrived quietly in Dunlow, Oregon, wrapped in a pale white fog that pressed low against the ground and blurred the line between earth and sky. The air was cold enough to turn breath into mist, sharp enough to wake old memories, but not cruel enough to freeze them in place. Ronan Ketter ran because stillness was dangerous. At 34, his body remained honed and angular, built from years of forced marches, saltwater dives, and long nights when sleep was considered a weakness. He stood just over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered without excess, his movements efficient rather than showy. His dark hair was cropped short in a way that never quite grew out of habit, and a rough shadow of beard permanently lived along his jaw, giving his sharp cheekbones a harder edge. People who met him often described him as distant but steady, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, whose silence carried weight. Once Ronan had been a Navy SEAL whose life revolved around clear objectives and decisive outcomes. That clarity was gone now. Mandatory leave had pulled him away from deployment. After an incident, no official report fully captured the loss of 2 teammates during a night extraction when visibility failed and hesitation cost lives. Since then, Ronan's sleep had become shallow and fragmented, haunted by moments where seconds stretched too long. Running was the only thing that quieted his mind, the rhythmic impact of boots against dirt, grounding him in the present. The trail he followed that morning curved away from the town's modest center toward the outskirts, where abandoned industrial remnants sat half-claimed by moss and pine needles. The old railway spur lay beyond a stand of trees, its tracks still active but rarely used, cutting through the land like a scar that refused to fade. Ronan usually avoided the area. Today, without consciously choosing it, his feet carried him closer. That was when the sound broke the fog. It was not the deep, territorial bark of a grown dog guarding property. It was high-pitched, urgent, uneven, raw with panic. Ronan slowed his pace, instincts flickering to life before a conscious thought could catch up. He scanned the tree line, his shoulders tightening slightly, posture shifting from runner to observer. Out of the low brush burst a German shepherd puppy, barely 10 months old by the look of him. His paws were too large for his still lean body, his movements awkward and fast, as if he had not yet learned how much space he occupied. His coat was the classic black and tan dark saddle, glossy with moisture from the fog-lighter fur along his legs already stained with mud. One ear stood upright while the other flopped forward stubbornly, giving him an unbalanced, almost comic expressions that clashed sharply with the intensity in his dark brown eyes. The puppy skidded to a stop directly in front of Ronan, chest heaving, tongue lolling as he barked again, short, sharp bursts that sounded less like warning and more like pleading. "Easy," Ronan muttered automatically, voice low. and controlled the same tone he once used to calm panicked civilians in conflict zones. He expected an owner to appear behind the dog, an apology forming in advance. No one came. The puppy lunged forward and caught the hem of Ronan's running pants between small but sharp teeth. He tugged hard enough to stretch the fabric claws scraping against the dirt as he pulled backward. Ronan frowned, stopping completely now. He looked down at the animal, taking in the tremor running through the dog's body, the way his tail stayed low, not wagging, not aggressive. Fear, pure and unfiltered. Ronan had seen it in men pinned down by gunfire, in eyes darting for exits that did not exist. "Hey," he said more firmly, crouching slightly. "Let go." The puppy released the fabric but did not retreat. Instead, he spun around and ran several yards back toward the fog-choked trees, then stopped, turning sharply to bark once more. His stance was rigid, purposeful, his entire body angled forward like an arrow pointing the way. Ronan straightened slowly. He checked his watch out of reflex, the motion so ingrained it felt automatic. He had planned a 6-mile loop. He had planned to be home, showered and detached from the world before noon. Plans, however, had a habit of dissolving when ignored by reality. The fog ahead seemed thicker, heavier, swallowing sound and distance. Ronan felt the familiar internal pull, the discipline drilled into him, screaming to maintain course, to ignore distractions, to finish what he started. But another voice rose beneath it, older and harder to silence, forged in places where ignoring a sign meant never going home. Something was wrong. The puppy barked again, stamping one oversized paw against the ground, then darted forward before stopping once more, glancing back over his shoulder as if checking whether Ronan was following. Ronan exhaled slowly through his nose. "Damn it," he murmured, not angry, just resigned. He stepped off the trail. The ground immediately changed beneath his feet, becoming uneven and damp roots hidden under a slick layer of pine needles. The smell of rusted metal and wet wood crept into the air as the trees thinned. The puppy Brim, though Ronan did not yet know his name, moved ahead in frantic bursts, never straying far enough to lose sight of the man behind him. As they moved, Ronan's mind worked the way it always did, in uncertain situations, cataloging details. The fog muffled sound. Visibility was poor. The direction they were heading aligned with the old rail crossing. He felt his jaw tighten. Brim slowed suddenly, ears flicking forward. A low vibration rolled through the ground, subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to notice such things. Ronan stopped short. There it was, the distant sound of a train horn, faint but growing, its echo stretched thin by the fog. The timing was wrong. The freight schedule was irregular but not unpredictable. Someone should not have been near the tracks at this hour. The puppy barked wildly now, circling in tight loops, then sprinted ahead again. Ronan broke into a run, no longer cautious, boots slipping slightly as urgency took over. The trees gave way to a narrow clearing, and through the haze the dark steel lines of the railway emerged. Then he saw her. An elderly woman sat in a wheelchair at the crossing, positioned awkwardly between the rails. She was small-framed, her posture rigid with tension rather than frailty. Wisps of silver hair escaped a neat bun at the back of her head, framing a face lined by time but not yet defeated by it. Her coat was a heavy wool gray, buttoned all the way to her throat, and her gloved hands clenched the armrests so tightly her knuckles showed pale beneath the fabric. Her name was Maeve Hollis, though Ronan would learn that later. What he saw now was a woman who had lived long enough to recognize danger without panicking, even as fear flickered in her sharp blue eyes. The front wheel of her chair was lodged firmly in a warped plank at the edge of the crossing, angled just enough to trap her completely. Each attempt she made to pull back only drove it deeper into the gap. The train horn sounded again, closer this time, slicing through the fog like a blade. Maeve froze her gaze, lifting toward the sound, lips parting as if to speak, then pressing together again. She did not scream, she did not flail. She simply sat there, breathing fast, as though weighing the distance between herself and the approaching inevitability. Brim skidded to her side, placing his body directly in front of the stuck wheel, barking furiously at the tracks as if daring the train itself to stop. Ronan's chest tightened. He took in the scene in less than a second: the fog, the trapped wheel, the approaching train, the old wood weakened by years of neglect. There was no room for hesitation, no margin for error. "Ma'am," he shouted, voice cutting through the mist with command-grade authority. "Don't move. Don't try to pull back." Maeve turned her head toward him, eyes widening slightly at the sight of a stranger emerging from the fog, tall and imposing, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to danger. For a brief moment, relief and fear warred across her face. "The wheel's stuck," she said, voice steady but tight. "I can't." "I know," Ronan said, already closing the distance. "I've got you." The train horn blared again, close enough now that the vibration rattled in Ronan's bones. He planted his feet beside the chair, boots slipping on damp wood, hands gripping the solid frame. Brim barked once more, then went silent, eyes locked on Ronan, as if trusting him with everything. Ronan braced himself, and the fog, thick and ancient, held its breath. The fog did not thin as Ronan stepped onto the wooden planks of the crossing. It thickened, clinging to his clothes, dampening sound, turning distance into a lie. The world narrowed to the steel rails beneath his feet, the hunched figure in the wheelchair and the growing vibration rolling through the ground like an approaching storm buried underground. Maeve Hollis sat rigidly between the rails, her spine straight with a dignity that felt almost defiant. At 76, her body had thinned with age, shoulders narrow beneath the heavy gray wool coat she wore year-round regardless of season. Her face was sharply contoured, cheekbones, pronounced skin pale and weathered, like old parchment touched by too many winters. Strands of silver hair had escaped the careful bun at the nape of her neck, plastered to her temples by the cold mist. Her blue eyes, clear piercing, tracked Ronan with quiet calculation rather than panic. The wheelchair itself was sturdy but old. Its metal frame scuffed, the rubber of the front caster torn where it had caught the splintered edge of a rotted plank. That wheel was wedged deep, angled just enough to lock the chair in place. Every attempt Maeve had made to free herself had driven it further down the wood, cracking softly in protest. Behind them, the train horns screamed again, closer now, no longer distant or abstract. It was a physical presence, a sound that vibrated through bone and marrow, demanding attention. Ronan dropped into a crouch beside the chair, boots skidding slightly on slick wood. The smell of rust and wet timber filled his lungs. His mind shifted into a mode he had not consciously entered. In months, calm, ruthless clarity, distance to impact, structural integrity of the crossing, weight of the chair, his own footing. "Listen to me," he said, voice low but carrying authority honed in chaos. "Do not move. Do not lean forward. I need you still." Maeve's fingers tightened on the armrests. Her hands were thin veins, raised knuckles swollen with age, but her grip was iron. "I'm not moving," she said, her voice steady, edged with something harder than fear. "Just don't drop me." Ronan met her gaze for a fraction of a second. "I won't." Brim hovered inches away, body tense, ears half raised, tail low. His chest vibrated with a low whine that never quite became a bark. Mud clung to his legs and his oversized paws slipped slightly on the planks as he shifted from foot to foot, eyes darting between Ronan and the approaching rails. He wanted to help, but did not yet know how. Instinct alone kept him there, planted like a living warning sign. The train horn sounded again, and this time Ronan could hear the clatter of wheels on track, the metallic rhythm accelerating toward them. He placed both hands on the rigid frame of the wheelchair, fingers wrapping around cold metal. The structure groaned under pressure. The crossing itself trembled faintly, a shudder running through the rotted wood, as if the earth were inhaling before a scream. "On three," Ronan said. One, Maeve inhaled sharply, her shoulders lifting under the coat. 2. The horn blared unbearably close now, cutting through the fog in a long, furious cry. Ronan did not say 3. He heaved. The movement was not a yank born of panic, but a controlled lift, driven by muscle memory, core, engaged legs, braced spine locked. The wheelchair rose just enough for the trapped front caster to snap free with a splintering crack that echoed like a gunshot. Maeve gasped, fingers clawing briefly at Ronan's sleeve, her breath leaving her in a sharp cry as the chair tilted. Ronan pivoted, turning his body sideways, boots sliding as he fought for traction. For a heartbeat, the rear wheels caught against the rail, resisting like the last grip of a past that refused to let go. The train burst through the fog. Its engine loomed suddenly, massive and unstoppable, steel and momentum screaming as it tore forward. Wind blasted outward, whipping Ronan's jacket against his frame, ripping Maeve's loose hair free from its bun. The noise was deafening, a living force pressing against them. Ronan shoved again, teeth clenched, muscles screaming as the wheelchair lurched backward, clearing the rail by inches. The train roared past, a blur of iron and motion, the force of it nearly knocking Ronan to his knees. He staggered but did not release the chair, guiding it over the uneven edge of the crossing and onto the gravel beyond. He did not stop until they were several yards away, the ground solid beneath his boots, the tracks safely behind them. The train thundered on cars, rattling and clanking, the horn fading as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a sudden ringing silence. Ronan let go of the chair and staggered back a step, chest heaving. His breath came in harsh pulls, fogging the air in front of his face. Adrenaline burned through him hot and sharp, masking the ache already blooming in his arms and shoulders. Maeve sat frozen for a moment, eyes wide, staring at the empty space where the train had been. Then her body began to tremble, not violently, but with a fine, relentless shiver that betrayed how close she had come. Brim bounded forward, placing his front paws awkwardly on Maeve's knees before scrambling into her lap, his movements clumsy but urgent. He pressed his head against her chest, whining softly, licking at her gloved hands, as if counting them, making sure they were still there. Maeve's hands lifted automatically, fingers burying themselves in the thick fur at his neck. She bowed her head, resting her forehead against his, breathing him in. "You stubborn thing," she whispered, voice breaking at last. "You didn't leave." Ronan watched the exchange, something tight and unfamiliar twisting in his chest. He turned away briefly, scanning the tracks, checking for any sign of further danger, forcing his breathing to slow. When he looked back, Maeve was watching him. Up close, she looked older than she had from a distance, lines deep around her mouth and eyes, but there was nothing frail in her gaze. It held a sharpness, a quiet intelligence honed by years of living alone and making decisions without permission. "You ran straight at it," she said. "Most people would have frozen." Ronan shrugged slightly, a reflexive deflection. "Didn't seem like an option." Maeve studied him, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You military?" He hesitated, then nodded once. "Used to be." She absorbed that gaze, flicking briefly to the way he stood, feet planted, shoulders squared even now, as if expecting another threat to emerge from the fog. "Figures," she murmured. "Only soldiers move like that when death's screaming at them." Brim finally settled, curling against Maeve's torso, his breathing slowing. The fog began to thin, revealing more of the neglected crossing, the faded warning sign with peeling red letters, the warped boards slick with moisture, weeds creeping between gravel and rail. Ronan crouched again, inspecting the broken plank where the wheel had caught. The wood crumbled under his fingers with barely any pressure. "This crossing should have been closed," he muttered. "Someone should have replaced these boards years ago." Maeve's mouth curved into a thin, humorless smile. "Welcome to Dunlow. Things don't get fixed unless they collapse." Ronan stood and placed a hand on the handle of her wheelchair, careful, now gentle. "Where were you headed?" Maeve hesitated, glancing back toward the path that led away from the tracks, a narrow strip of dirt disappearing into the trees. Home, she said, just on the other side of the lake. I take this shortcut every morning, or I did. Her fingers tightened briefly in Brim's fur, didn't realize the wood had rotted this badly. Ronan nodded already, assessing the terrain ahead. The fog was lifting, but the ground remained slick, uneven. Not ideal for a wheelchair. I'll walk you back, he said, not phrased as a question. Maeve opened her mouth to protest, pride flickering across her face like a reflex, then stopped. She exhaled slowly. All right, she said at last, but only to the edge of my property. Ronan's lips twitched faintly, the closest thing to a smile. Deal. He guided the chair away from the tracks, boots crunching over gravel as Brim trotted alongside, occasionally glancing back as if to confirm that both humans were still where they belonged. As they moved, the train's echo faded entirely, replaced by birdsong cautiously returning to the air. The danger had passed, but Ronan knew deep in his bones that this moment, this narrow escape carved out of fog and timing, was only the beginning of something else. Something slower, quieter, and far more complicated than running toward a screaming horn. The crossing disappeared behind them, swallowed once more by mist, as the path ahead opened into the uncertain calm of what came next. The train had vanished into the fog, but its presence lingered in Ronan's body like an echo trapped in bone. He stood beside the wheelchair on the damp grass, hands still hovering near the handles, as if the danger might surge back without warning. The ground sloped gently away from the tracks, uneven with stones and roots, and the fog thinned just enough to reveal a narrow path winding toward the lake. The air smelled of wet pine and cold iron. Ronan forced his breathing into a slower rhythm, counting exhales the way he had been taught when the world refused to calm on its own. Maeve Hollis remained motionless for several seconds, her gaze fixed on the empty rails. The tremor that had seized her earlier had not stopped. It had merely retreated inward, settling deep in her shoulders and hands. Up close, the fine network of lines around her eyes told a story of decades spent squinting into weather and work, of a woman who had learned to measure danger and keep moving anyway. She drew in a long breath, then another, and finally looked up at Ronan with a frankness that startled him. "You lifted me like I weighed nothing," she said quietly. There was no flattery in her tone, only fact, as if she were inventorying what had just occurred. Ronan shook his head once, a small denial. Adrenaline, he replied, though he knew it was only half true. He could still feel the jolt of the chair breaking free, the moment when time compressed into a single, unforgiving line. He bent slightly, hands on his thighs, stretching out the tightness in his lower back. The rough shadow of beard along his jaw darkened as he exhaled, and the muscle near his temple pulsed briefly. An old tell one Maeve noticed, even if she did not yet know its meaning. Brim circled them, then stopped, planting himself squarely in front of Maeve's knees again, as if resuming a post he had been assigned. His ears twitched at every sound, one standing straight, the other still flopping forward with stubborn independence. Mud streaked his legs and chest, and his sides rose and fell quickly, the frantic edge finally draining from his breath. He lifted his head and gave Ronan a long, assessing look, tail making a cautious half-wag. Whatever calculation lived behind those dark eyes seemed to conclude in approval. Maeve followed the dog's gaze and let out a soft, breathy laugh that surprised even her. "Well," she said, voice thin but steadying, "at least one of us trusts you completely." She reached down and smoothed Brim's fur with practiced gentleness. Her hands were steadier now, though the cold had not left them. "You're not from around here," she added, glancing back at Ronan. "People in Dunlow don't run toward trains." Ronan straightened instinctively, scanning the path ahead before answering. "Just passing through," he said. It was a habit to keep explanations short, a way of preserving distance. But Maeve's eyes remained on him, patient and unblinking, the way someone looks when they have earned the right to a real answer. He relented slightly. "I'm staying nearby for a while," he amended. She nodded, accepting the partial truth. Long enough to make trouble, she said, not accusing, merely observant. Or to fix some. Ronan moved behind the wheelchair without thinking, hands settling lightly on the grips. The familiarity of the position surprised him. It felt natural, purposeful. He tested the balance, mindful of the uneven terrain. "Your house is this way?" he asked. Maeve hesitated, chin lifting a fraction. Pride flared briefly in her expression, sharp and reflexive, before softening. "Along the lake," she said. "There's a path. It's not perfect." The pause held a quiet admission she did not voice outright. "Most things aren't," Ronan replied. He began to guide the chair forward at a measured pace, adjusting instinctively for each dip and stone. Brim trotted alongside on Maeve's left, occasionally glancing back as if checking alignment, then forging ahead to scout the ground. The fog thinned further as they moved away from the tracks, light filtering through the trees in pale streaks. As they walked, Maeve's breathing settled into a calmer cadence. The initial shock gave way to something heavier. Reflection, perhaps, or the delayed weight of what might have been. She spoke without looking back at Ronan. "My husband worked those rails," she said. 30 years. Freight, mostly. He knew every schedule by heart. Her fingers tightened slightly on the blanket draped over her lap. "I learned to listen for trains the way some people listen for weather." Ronan said nothing, giving her space to continue if she wished. "He died before the crossing got bad," Maeve went on. "Heart, not steel." A pause. "I still hear his voice when the horn sounds, telling me where to stand, where not to." She swallowed, jaw tightening. "Guess even experience can't save you from rot." The word lingered between them, rot. Not just of wood and planks, but of neglect of time left unchecked. Ronan felt it resonate uncomfortably close to home. He adjusted his grip, lifting the front casters slightly as they crossed a particularly rutted section of the path. The movement was smooth, economical, betraying training he rarely spoke of. They reached the edge of a small clearing where the lake revealed itself gray and still beneath the lingering mist. Maeve's house sat back from the water, a modest, weathered structure of dark timber and stone. It was not grand, but it was solid in the way old things sometimes are built with intention, even if maintenance had lagged. A narrow wooden ramp led to the front door, its surface slick with moisture, the angle steeper than it should have been. Ronan slowed, assessing. The ramp bowed slightly and the middle boards worn smooth by years of use. "You manage this on your own?" he asked, carefully neutral. Maeve's mouth curved into a wry smile. "I have," she said, "mostly." Brim reached the base of the ramp first and stopped, looking back. He placed one paw on the wood, then withdrew it, nose twitching as if uncertain. His hesitation mirrored Ronan's unspoken concern. Ronan guided the chair to the base and tested the ramp with his boot, feeling the give beneath the sole. "It's slick," he said. "I'll take it slow." Maeve's shoulders squared. "I'm not fragile," she said, more to herself than to him. "I know," Ronan replied. "That's why I'm careful." He pushed steadily, weight balanced, eyes fixed on the point where wood met stone. The chair ascended without incident, though Ronan felt the subtle shift of the ramp under load. At the top, Maeve reached out and unlocked the door with practiced efficiency, her movements precise despite lingering tremors. Inside, the house smelled faintly of old paper wood smoke and something herbal tea, perhaps. The entryway was narrow, cluttered with the quiet artifacts of a life lived alone. A small table stacked with mail, a coat rack bearing a single worn jacket, photographs lining the wall in mismatched frames. Ronan took it in quickly, cataloging obstacles without judgment. The threshold caught the wheels slightly. He lifted them without comment. "Set me by the window," Maeve said, pointing toward a low armchair near the front. "I like to see the lake when I come in." Ronan complied, positioning the chair carefully. He stepped back, then giving her space, unsure of the protocol. Now that the immediate danger had passed, Brim, freed from vigilance, shook himself vigorously, spraying droplets across the floor, then padded over to the window to stare out as if guarding the horizon. Maeve removed her gloves, slowly flexing her fingers. The tremor returned briefly, then subsided. She looked at Ronan again, studying him with renewed intensity. "You didn't freeze," she said. "Not for a second. That kind of calm. It's learned." Her eyes flicked to his hands, still bearing faint scars. "Something happened to you." It was not a question. Ronan's jaw tightened. He considered deflecting the familiar shield, rising automatically. Instead, he offered a measured truth. "I spent a long time learning how not to hesitate," he said. "Unlearning, it's harder." Maeve nodded, understanding settling in her expression. "Fear teaches you," she said softly. "So does guilt." The words landed with uncanny precision. Silence filled the room, not awkward but heavy with shared recognition. Outside, the fog continued to lift, revealing the lake's far shore, the path they had traveled now visible in full daylight. The danger felt distant, almost unreal, but the memory of it pulsed just beneath the surface. Ronan glanced toward the ramp again, then back at Maeve. "That crossing," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It's not safe. Neither is that ramp." "I know you didn't ask," Maeve raised a hand, stopping him gently. "I know what you're going to say," she replied. "And I know what I'm going to say back." She paused, then surprised him with a small, tired smile. "But not today. Today, I'm going to make tea. And you," she glanced at Brim, who had settled by the window, "ears alert, are going to sit down before your legs remember they almost gave out." Ronan let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. He nodded once. "All right." As Maeve turned her chair toward the kitchen, Brim followed, already adapting to the new perimeter he seemed to have claimed. Ronan remained standing for a moment longer, looking out at the lake, the tracks hidden now by distance and light. He felt the familiar urge to leave, to keep moving, before roots could form. But something held him there, unfinished, unresolved. The rescue was over. The consequences were not. Afternoon light crept through the tall pines surrounding Maeve Hollis's house, thinning the last threads of fog into pale ribbons that drifted across the lake. The quiet that followed the morning's violence felt almost unreal, as if the world were holding itself still to see whether anyone would speak first. Ronan remained by the window, where he had paused moments earlier, broad shoulders relaxed, but alert, his reflection faint in the glass. The rough shadow along his jaw had darkened as the day wore on, and the fine lines at the corners of his eyes hinted at a vigilance that never truly slept. Maeve maneuvered her wheelchair toward the kitchen, with practiced efficiency, movements precise, despite the lingering tremor in her hands. Up close, the house told its own story, one of endurance rather than neglect. The wooden floor bore scars from decades of use, each nick a memory rather than a flaw. A cast-iron stove sat against the far wall, blackened by time but well cared for. Shelves lined with mismatched mugs and jars of dried herbs gave the space a grounded, lived-in warmth that contradicted its silence. Maeve's presence filled the room in a way Ronan hadn't expected. She was small, yes, but carried herself with a stubborn gravity that anchored the air. Brim patted after her nails, clicking softly on the floor, then paused to sniff a basket near the door. He sneezed, offended by the dust, then flopped down with a huff near Ronan's boots, resting his chin on his oversized paws. At 10 months, he was all angles and energy, but now a different instinct had taken over, guarding waiting learning. His coat had begun to dry, the black saddle dulling to a matte sheen, the tan fur along his legs warming in color under the light. Maeve set a kettle on the stove and reached for a mug, fingers brushing the rim before she steadied herself. "You don't have to stay," she said without turning voice, even. "I've kept myself alive this long." Ronan shifted his weight, the old impulse to leave tugging at him like a tide. He had spent years exiting places the moment the danger passed, convinced that staying invited complications he couldn't afford. But the image of the ramp outside, slick and bowed, rose unbidden in his mind. He thought of the crossing's rotted plank, the way neglect hid behind familiarity. "I know," he said. "I just want to make sure you're settled." Maeve snorted softly. "Settled," she repeated as if tasting the word. "People say that when they want you to stop moving." She turned, then blue eyes sharp beneath the silver wisps of hair that framed her face. "I didn't survive my husband, the rails, and a body that stopped listening just to be tucked away like fragile glass." The kettle began to hum. Ronan nodded, absorbing the rebuke without offense. He had seen that look before, the flint-hard refusal to be defined by limitation. It reminded him of men who refused evacuation with shrapnel still in their legs, not because they were reckless, but because surrender felt worse than pain. "I'm not here to tuck you anywhere," he said quietly, "just to point out the cracks before they turn into traps." Maeve regarded him for a long moment, then turned back to the stove. The kettle whistled shrill and insistent until she removed it and poured water with steady hands into 2 mugs. She pushed one across the counter toward him. "Tea," she said. "Chamomile. It won't fix anything, but it might slow you down." Ronan accepted the mug, heat seeping into his palms. The scent was faint and earthy, calming in a way that bypassed thought. He took a cautious sip, eyes scanning the room out of habit. Thresholds, narrow passages, rugs that could catch a wheel. He noticed the height of the counters just slightly too tall for Maeve's reach, the way she compensated by angling the chair closer, shoulders tensing each time. It wasn't pity he felt. It was recognition of a battlefield few acknowledged. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and brief. Maeve stiffened. "That'll be Eleanor," she said, a note of resignation creeping into her voice. "She worries." Loudly. Ronan moved instinctively toward the door, then paused, glancing back at Maeve for permission. She nodded once. "Go on, she'll talk your ear off either way." Ronan opened the door to reveal a woman in her early 60s, tall and lean, wrapped in a weathered green parka. Her hair was a practical brown shot through with gray, pulled into a low ponytail, and her face bore the ruddy marks of a life spent outdoors. Eleanor Pike's eyes were sharp and assessing, taking in Ronan's height, his build, the scars on his hands. Her mouth tightened slightly, not unkindly but cautious. "Afternoon," she said. "I saw the tracks from the road, thought I'd check in." Her gaze flicked past him to Maeve. "You all right?" Maeve rolled forward, chin lifted. "I'm fine, Eleanor." This is, she paused, glancing at Ronan. He was helpful. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Helpful how Ronan stepped back to give Maeve space. "Wrong place, right time," he said simply. Eleanor studied him for another beat, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "Well," she said, "tea's on then. I'll leave you to it." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Maeve, you holler if you need anything." Maeve smiled thinly. "I always do." When Eleanor left, the quiet returned heavier now, with unspoken things. Maeve sipped her tea, gaze drifting to a photograph on the wall, her younger self beside a man in a railway uniform, both smiling at something beyond the frame. "People mean well," she said. "They just don't know how to help without taking over." Ronan leaned against the counter, careful not to block her path. "Control feels like safety," he said, "especially after something goes wrong." She glanced at him, surprised by the insight. "And for you?" "For me," Ronan said after a pause, "control was the job. Losing it. That's what hurts." The admission hung between them, raw but brief. Maeve didn't press. She nodded once, acknowledging without prying. Outside, the light shifted, clouds gathering again. Over the lake, the promise of rain murmuring at the edges of the day. Maeve set her mug aside. You mentioned cracks, she said. Go on then, point them out. Ronan hesitated, then gestured toward the doorway. The ramp, he said. It bows, underweight. Needs new boards, better grip. Inside, he indicated the threshold. This lip can catch a wheel if you're tired. The rug by the sink slides. And the crossing. He stopped himself, jaw tightening. You shouldn't be using it. Maeve bristled. That's my shortcut. It's a gamble, Ronan replied evenly. One you don't need to take. Silence followed, charged but not hostile. Maeve exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping a fraction. I don't like being told what not to do, she said, but I like funerals less. She met his gaze squarely. What are you suggesting? Ronan considered his words carefully. I can fix the ramp, secure the threshold, add grip. It won't make you dependent. It'll make the house work with you, not against you. And the crossing. He shook his head. That's bigger than me, but I can help you plan a safer route. Maeve looked away, staring out the window at the lake where ripples chased each other in widening rings. The desire to remain self-sufficient warred visibly with the memory of steel and fog. Finally, she nodded. One condition, she said. You don't do it because you feel sorry for me. Ronan met her eyes. I don't, he said simply. I do it because leaving things broken gets people killed. A faint smile touched her mouth. That'll do. Rain began to fall, then light, at first tapping against the roof like a cautious visitor. Brim lifted his head, ears pricking, then relaxed again when nothing followed. He rose, padded over to Maeve, and rested his chin against her knee-tail, thumping once. She scratched behind his ears, the tension easing from her posture. Ronan finished his tea and set the mug in the sink. He felt the familiar urge to check his watch to measure the day against some internal schedule. He resisted it. For once, there was no extraction window to meet, no report to file. There was only a quiet house, a stubborn woman and a dog who had decided where he belonged. I'll come by tomorrow, Ronan said. If that's all right. Maeve nodded. Tomorrow, she agreed, but tonight, you go. Even the quiet needs rest. Ronan moved toward the door, pausing once to glance back. Maeve sat by the window framed by the lake and the gathering dusk, Brim at her side. The house no longer felt empty. It felt like something had shifted, subtle, unfinished, but real. Outside, the rain thickened, drumming a steady rhythm against the earth. Ronan pulled his jacket tighter and stepped off the porch, already mapping repairs in his mind. He did not yet realize that in choosing to fix a ramp, he was beginning to rebuild something far less tangible than wood. The weather settled into a rare, cooperative rhythm. A few days after the crossing, thin sunlight in the morning that softened the lake's surface to brushed silver, a colder afternoon that tightened joints and sharpened thought, and evenings where wind tapped insistently at the house like a creditor demanding attention. Ronan Ketter returned at first light on the third day, not with the urgency of a rescuer, but with the deliberate calm of a man intent on preventing the need for rescue at all. He arrived in worn work boots and a canvas jacket faded to the color of storm clouds, the rough shadow of beard still lining his angular jaw. He carried tools instead of weapons, and the weight of that difference mattered to him more than he admitted. Maeve Hollis watched from the window as he unloaded lumber and hardware, her reflection faint in the glass. She sat straight in her wheelchair, shoulders squared beneath a charcoal sweater, silver hair pinned back with care. At 76, her frame was slight, but her presence was not. Time had pared her down to essentials, resolve, memory, and a stubborn sense of ownership over her life. Brim, the German shepherd puppy, pressed his nose to the glass beside her breath, fogging a small circle as his ears twitched at every movement Ronan made outside. His coat had dried to a clean black and tan sheen, and though his paws were still oversized, his posture was changing, less frantic, more attentive, as if something inside him had found a job description. Maeve opened the door before Ronan knocked. "You're early," she said, tone measured. Ronan inclined his head. Lights better, boards set, truer, she snorted softly. You talk like a carpenter, I listen, he replied, setting the tools down. With care, they talk. The ramp was first. Ronan removed the bowed boards, exposing damp supports that had softened with years of weather. He replaced them with pressure-treated lumber, adding a textured strip for grip and a handrail at a height Maeve could reach without strain. He worked efficiently, movements, economical, shoulders and forearms flexing under the jacket. Maeve wheeled closer to observe, eyes narrowed, not suspicious, but precise, like a foreman inspecting a job site. This isn't a rescue, she said again, the refrain less sharp than before. I didn't ask for a team. Ronan measured a cut and met her gaze. This isn't a team, he said. It's logistics. You want freedom? You need routes that don't betray you. She considered that, lips pressed thin. You sound like my husband, she murmured, and for a moment the air shifted with memory. Then she lifted her chin. All right. Logistics. By mid-morning the ramp was solid, the handrail anchored the threshold. Inside smoothed so the wheels passed without catching. Ronan moved next to the path, leveling stones and setting pavers where roots had lifted the ground. He worked with a quiet focus that left little room for small talk, but Maeve filled the spaces anyway, narrating the history of the house in short, unsentimental bursts. When the roof was patched, which winter cracked the back window. How the lake rose every spring and pretended it owned the place. Brim shadowed Ronan at a respectful distance, occasionally stepping too close and then correcting himself as if testing invisible boundaries. When Ronan paused to drink water, the puppy sat unprompted, head tilted, waiting. Ronan noticed. He noticed everything. After lunch, a simple affair of soup, Maeve insisted on heating herself. Ronan took Brim to the yard. The grass sloped gently toward the lake, and the wind carried the clean scent of pine. Heel, Ronan said quietly, tapping his thigh. Brim hesitated, tail flicking, then moved into position at Ronan's left. Ronan took a step. Brim matched it. Another step. Another match. When Brim surged ahead, Ronan stopped. Brim stopped too, skidding slightly, then looked up, ears pricked. Ronan nodded once, approval subtle but unmistakable. Maeve watched from the porch, arms folded, expression skeptical. He pulls, she said. Always has. He needs a purpose, Ronan replied without looking back. Not chaos, not fear, a job. And his job is... what? Being my shadow, being your teammate, Ronan said. He learns your pace, your stops, your hazards. He doesn't pull, he blocks, he waits. They practiced beside the wheelchair. Brim learned to sit just ahead of the front casters when Maeve stopped, learned to step wide around obstacles, learned to freeze at the edge of the ramp until Maeve reached for the rail. He made mistakes, clipped a wheel, once tangled himself another time, but Ronan corrected gently, consistently. Maeve bristled once, twice, then relaxed as she felt the difference, the absence of sudden jerks, the steadiness at transitions, the quiet confidence that replaced vigilance. You're turning him into a soldier, she said, not unkindly. Ronan smiled faintly. No, a specialist. In the late afternoon, a freight train passed far beyond the trees, its horn low and distant. Maeve stiffened, hand tightening on the armrest. Ronan paused, watching her face. Brim sat, eyes on Maeve, body angled protectively. The sound faded, leaving behind a surprising calm. That one didn't sound like a threat, Maeve said, surprised. Ronan saw at the last paver. Context matters. She nodded slowly. So does distance. By dusk, the work was done. The path lay smooth and true, the ramp secure, the house cooperating rather than resisting. Maeve rolled the length of the porch once, then, again testing the rail, the grip, the turn at the door. She stopped at the edge and looked out toward the lake, where the sky deepened to blue-gray. Thank you, she said at last, the words spare and strong. Not for saving me, for letting me keep myself. Ronan wiped his hands on a rag, chest easing. You did that. He packed his tools as the light thinned. Maeve wheeled beside him, Brim between them, tail swaying in a measured rhythm. You're leaving, she observed, not accusing. Sun's going, Ronan said, and habits die hard. She considered him, then nodded. You can come back, she said, as if granting permission to a weather pattern, if you want. Ronan paused, something unknotted in his chest. I will. He stepped off the porch as the first stars appeared. Brim followed a few yards, then stopped, turned and looked back at Maeve. She lifted a hand. Go on, she told him softly. Brim glanced at Ronan, then back at Maeve, then settled at her side, choosing stillness over chase. Ronan smiled to himself. The pack, it seemed, understood its boundaries. As Ronan walked down the path, the wind softened. The crossing remained distant, diminished. The mission had changed, not to pull someone from the jaws of steel, but to build a life that didn't need heroics to survive. He felt no sense of abandonment, no itch to run, only the quiet satisfaction of a job done right. Behind him, Maeve sat on the porch, Brim's warm weight at her knee, listening to the lake. She did not say thank you like someone made small by help. She said it like someone old enough to know that accepting care does not shrink the self, it steadies it, and in that steadiness, the heart remained exactly where it belonged. Sometimes the miracle does not arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes it comes disguised as timing, a stubborn heart, a steady pair of hands, or a dog who refuses to let go. God does not always stop the train. Sometimes he sends the right soul to the crossing at the exact moment it matters. In our daily lives, we often pray for the big signs, for doors to open, storms to part, pain to disappear. But more often, God works in quieter ways. He gives us courage when fear says freeze. He gives us humility when pride says handle it alone. He gives us love that shows up not to rescue us once, but to make sure we don't need rescuing again. If you are watching this and feel tired, afraid, or alone, remember this. You are not forgotten, you are not invisible, and help is not a weakness, it is a blessing allowed. May God watch over you and your family. May he guard every crossing in your life, both the loud dangers and the silent ones. May he send you the right people, and may he give you the wisdom to let them stay. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone, and subscribe to the channel so these stories of faith, love, and quiet miracles can continue to reach those who need them most. May God bless you, protect you, and walk beside you today and through every storm yet to come.